Thanks for joining us once again for our small group ministry study over the Old Testament, and we're going to be talking today about Genesis chapters 4 through 9. And we have here once again with us Chad to help us out with this. Chad, why don't you go ahead and start reading in chapter 4 of Genesis.
Cool. Starting in verse 1. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again she gave birth to his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel his brother. And it came about when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and killed him.
All right, so this is one of the stories in the Bible that is really so densely packed with information that it's hard to unpack it all. And we only have a few minutes to do that, so we'll get right into it. When you think of worshiping God and bringing a sacrifice, you read that a certain way. How do you think people who aren't Christians, if we read this passage, how do you think they look at the idea of bringing a sacrifice to worship God? How would they view that?
I think they might let it lessen the Christian idea of who God is, maybe in their minds. And I think they might look at it in this particular case as a little bit capricious on God's part of having regard for one and maybe not for the other.
Okay. So when we encounter this text, immediately we are in the position of trying to struggle with something that's outside of kind of the modern mindset. And the thing that's fascinating about this is that if we talk about a sacrifice, and if we ask, go out to Mill Avenue and we ask people about whether they've made any sacrifices in their life, what would they say, do you think?
They might say, I spent 4 years in college and paid the university and, things of this sort. Or, as parents, you might be like, well, I went without X, Y, and Z to put my kids through college or, things of this sort.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing is that they would know what we were talking about. If we use the word sacrifice, they would know what we're talking about. The interesting thing is they would probably not have a problem with the idea of sacrifice itself because, we all make sacrifices. Now, the interesting thing is they would have a problem with sacrificing to God, and that's one of the stranger aspects of this because, you make a sacrifice to go to school, you make a sacrifice to take a job, you make a sacrifice. There are a lot of different areas of our lives that we sacrifice, and yet we find the idea of sacrificing to God to be particularly problematic. And then the idea that his favor might be tied to the nature of that sacrifice we find problematic as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's one of those things that we know, but we don't know that we know it, right? Because the thing is that if you look at let's say you have two brothers, and one of them goes to medical school and becomes a doctor, and has puts off a lot of enjoyment in his life until he's in his 30s, and is then successful, and then you have his brother who gets a job right out of high school because he wants to buy a new car, and then he's going around and going to movies and doing all kinds of fun stuff because he's got this entry-level job. Maybe in their late 30s, the differences, the trajectories of their lives are going to be much different. Now, would you say that most people have an understanding of that and see it as the natural course of events?
To a certain degree, yes.
Okay.
And maybe less so than they used to, but yes.
Okay, so the thing that's interesting is what do you think then the major hang-up is with people looking at the idea of sacrificing to God and having different outcomes is? If we accept it in the realm of life when we don't posit to God, why all of a sudden does it become a problem when we do?
I think people see the direct causality in the case of foregoing pleasure and a new car and movies and stuff like that to get through med school, and they see the cause and effect, but I don't think they see it in the case of offering a sacrifice to God.
Okay, which is kind of interesting. If it's just in life with no God, then it makes sense to them. If there is a God, however, it starts to not make sense, which would mean that God has to be in the job of handing out life's blessings equally in order for him to I guess, have legitimacy in their eyes. I think sometimes even for us as Christians, it seems weird to think about Old Testament guys going and putting a sacrifice somewhere, something that doesn't get used, it gets burned up, whatever. In the Old Testament world, they obviously don't have as much material resources as we do, so putting something aside to be useless, to be burned up, to be sat until it rots, whatever it is that people picture in their mind when they think about somebody giving a sacrifice, seems very odd. And yet, how do you ascribe the worth of God without any kind of sacrifice, right? So how do you ascribe the worth of anything or anyone without some kind of sacrifice? If you say to you start dating a girl and you won't take her anywhere and you won't spend any money on her, you won't do any of that kind of stuff, but you say, hey, you're super important to me, but I won't change my plans for you, I won't buy you anything, I won't take you anywhere, she's obviously going to think that you don't really mean that, right? How do you ascribe the worth of something without making a sacrifice? There's a connection then between how much worth we ascribe to God and then the nature of our acceptance by God, or the nature of the outcome of our lives or the blessings in our lives. It's also kind of unclear what it means for one to be accepted and one to not be accepted, right? Except for there's a knowledge, right, that one is accepted and one's not. There's a knowledge that God looks at favor with at one sacrifice, and he looks with disfavor at the other. To die, to be an acceptable sacrifice. And I think that there might be something to that. And I think that when you look at Adam and Eve, and you find that when they put on fig leaves, God didn't find that an adequate covering, but killed animals to put on them, that there might be a connection there with this sacrifice. And the idea seems to be one of that the appropriate sacrifice to give to God is the killing of the animal. And kind of what that seems to represent is the idea of the killing of the flesh, the killing of the fleshly self, the flesh that is talked about all through Scripture as kind of the seat of the things that the desires that are contrary to the Spirit. And it's interesting that you might ask yourself, well, what good does just burning something up? What good does that do anyone, right? If you found if you found your neighbor in his backyard and he had $10,000 on his grill and he was just burning it, and you said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm giving a sacrifice." You would probably find that not useful, right?
A little crazy.
A little crazy, and yet. It's not that there couldn't be some better use.
I would offer to take care of that for
you. Oh, would you? Yeah.
Yes.
You can sacrifice it by throwing it over the fence. But could there be something useful in him? Could it accomplish something in him? If all he does, like you might say, well, you can feed the homeless with this, you can do a lot of things with it, but is there something that can be accomplished in his own life that might bear a reward for him to give that up? If maybe money had become an idol in his life, by lighting that, not doing anything with it other than lighting it on fire, could there be something useful accomplished in his life that might change the trajectory of his existence?
For sure. I think that's, before we talked about people don't see the causation, but I think we're focused on, well, what does, because in any other context when you focus on the sacrifice, it's usually on who you're sacrificing for that kind of gets focused. But obviously, any sacrifice I make doesn't actually do anything for God who has everything.
Right.
But as you point out, it actually, we might be looking at this backwards and not realizing what it's accomplishing for the one making the sacrifice. And as you point out, there might not be another way for that to be accomplished. Yeah,
and one of the things that's really interesting about this is that the sacrifice, I think, might be just in the way that you look at life and you look at God. Because what happens to Cain and Abel? Cain makes the lesser sacrifice. It's not looked at favorably from God. And then what does he do? His countenance falls. Like, he sees the world differently. He sees God differently. He sees his brother differently, and he's angry. He's upset. He's emotionally in turmoil. Like, his life hasn't gotten any better. And you can imagine that Abel's probably out there in the field and being, hey, life is great. This is good, and right. And his brother's meanwhile, brooding, and all of a sudden life is different. Why? Well, if you look at the value that you place on God, the amount of trust that you place in Him, the amount of worth that you ascribe to Him, is going to change the way that you look at everything in your life. It's going to change the way that you look at everything in your life. If you think that God is so good and He has so much worth that He couldn't possibly do anything to me that's negative, well, then that changes everything about how you view your predicament, your situation. Versus if you think that, well, God's being unfair to me, God's being unjust to me, God, this whole situation is wrong. It's unjust. I'm the aggrieved party here, and you go through life with that chip on your shoulder, and over time it gets worse until the point where he kills his brother. Let's go ahead and read it.
Yeah, 9 through 15. And the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I don't know." "Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So the Lord said to him, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain so that no one finding him would slay him.
So what do you think about the curse and the way that it plays into? Do you find that it's kind of a natural result of the sin itself? Do you find that it doesn't bear any connection at all?
I find it interesting the parallel with the curse in Genesis 3 given to Adam. And the curse in the ground. And so, Adam and mankind's relationship to the ground was cursed. And we talked about potentially some of that being just the natural consequence of things. Mm-hmm. And I see the same thing here. I think part of it is natural. And I think also part of it, though, could definitely be supernatural as well. But I just think it's interesting, the exact same thing here, where in chapter 3 we see the curses relating to relationships between Adam and Eve and between the serpent and stuff like this. And here it's also a curse that affects Cain and his relationships with everybody else on the earth, but also between him and the ground. Yeah.
And so you find that the sin is kind of a sin between him and his brother, and now he can't live in community with his brothers. And I think that is kind of the natural thing that happens, is that if you walk through life with a chip on your shoulder, that it's not fair. And so God hasn't been fair to me, and what's even worse is that He's treating other people better than He's treating me. You take your disturbed view of God, and then you translate that into a disturbed view of other people. It's not fair. It's not fair what they have. It's not fair. Well, it's not hard to see that you would have a hard time living in community with other people. It's not hard to see that the curse of being a wanderer on the earth would probably, how do you stop any place and be a part of any community when that's what you can do? And the thing that's interesting about this to me is you see this with people. You've, I'm sure, have had experiences, I know I have, of working with people who constantly think that their greatness is not being recognized. And what you see in their life is an inability to operate within any kind of hierarchy. They can't keep a job. They're constantly going from job to job to job. They can't stay in any particular church. They can't stay in any particular relationship. That all of their relationships are are very fraught with difficulty and turbulence, and they're constantly going from place to place to place because these people don't recognize me and for my greatness, and these people didn't treat me the way I deserve to be treated, and these people didn't listen to what I had to say, and I worked for this company, but my boss was an idiot, and you know what I'm saying? You see that happen, and so it's not just. Obviously, it doesn't need to be a physical murder that precipitates that. It can be just the intellectual murder of well, that guy's not so good. That guy is not as good as I am. That guy, you know what I'm saying? And I think that this is a pretty accurate story about the effects of sin on our relationships with each other. That once you start to lessen the value of God and start questioning how God's dealt with you, that will spread into your interpersonal relationships. And I find it interesting that the Bible, this is the layout of the Bible. It's really taking us through, I think, the natural progression of things. Well, I think that's it for now, and we'll see you guys in part 2.